Jazz drummers! You've got your Tony Williamses, your Elvin Joneses, your Buddies, your Mel Lewises, your Roy Hayneses, then your modern folks, like Jeff Tain Watts, Bill Stewart, and Eric Harland. But who rules them all? Who, of the many jazz drummers over the decades, is the GOAT? Well, that's a topic that's sure to inspire polite, resigned consensus from the many sedate jazz fans out there. Right? Just kidding. I expect no shortage of controversy. But hey, obviously this is subjective and for fun. And in this video, we'll explore some of my favorite jazz drummers, some of whom you may not have heard of, talk about what makes them great, and try to narrow down a definition of the GOAT, so you can calmly nod in stately agreement. Just kidding. I mean, so you can tell me why I'm wrong in the comments. Oh yeah, my name is Nate, and people call me the 80/20 drummer, and I've got a little YouTube channel where we talk drum. Hang on. Where we talk drums. And relevant, I went to jazz school. And I suspect that will cause some of you to take me more seriously, and some of you to take me less seriously. And it's all part of the fun. Anyway, today on the channel, who's the greatest of them all? The answer may bore you to tears. Damn it! Surprise you! The answer may surprise you. Anyway, stay tuned. And folks, today's video is brought to you by me, the 80/20 drummer, and if you made it through that intro, and if you watched a few of my videos, you might be thinking you're ready to study with me. I don't know. Maybe you are, maybe you aren't. That's for you to decide. But if you are, I have a number of ways to do that, including my super intensive coaching programs, my group coaching programs, and my self-directed courses, all of which are exclusive to my mailing list. And there's only one way onto that list. Click the link below the player and enter your email address in on the next page. And for your troubles, we'll send you a free drum course I don't share on YouTube. That's it. Now, on with the video. Let's begin at the beginning, by way of kind of the end. You'll see what I mean. This is Jeremy Dutton, one of the young rising stars of jazz drumming. He's assimilated a lot of what came before, so you might be tempted to say drummers of his generation are the GOATs. But what about those who built the scaffold these modern jazz drummers sit on top of? The drummers on whose shoulders all of us who try to play jazz in 2024 now stand. People like Roy Haynes. And before him, Kenny Clark. And before him, one Mr. Papa Joe Jones. Bring it in for a sec. I used to have a music professor who would urge us to try to hear historical recordings as they might have sounded to people at the time. I.e., Louis Armstrong sounds classic to us today, but what would he have sounded like at the time to someone who'd never heard him? Probably very innovative. It's the same with so-called classic drummers like Papa Joe. Even though to us today he sounds old-timey, except that Papa Joe doesn't sound old-timey at all. Listen to this. When I was home from college for a summer, my parents got me a DVD box set about the evolution of jazz drumming. And yes, I'm aware that ages me. Guys, I'm over 18. Anyway, the biggest takeaway was you don't have to strain your ear much to hear how these giants of jazz drumming would have sounded at the time, because they sound fresh now. Partly it's because they have a lot of subtle licks that have been lost to time or fallen out of fashion, which makes them a goldmine for aspiring jazz drummers looking to do something based on history that's still unique. But just check out Papa Joe's technique, coordination, and musicality. It reminds you of an Eric Harland. Pick Papa Joe out of his era and let him learn drums in any era, and he would probably be world class. Which makes Papa Joe Jones, who kind of stands in for a whole bunch of innovators, our first contender. Jones was born in Chicago in 1911 and joined Count Basie's orchestra, the gig for which he'd become most famous, in 1934. He was one of the first true masters of the brushes, and widely acknowledged to be one of the forefathers of the modern chop kit. Which brings us to criterion 1 when we evaluate people for greatest of all time. Do we judge them for how far they carried the ball down the field from their starting point? Because if that's the case, Papa Joe carried a lot of jazz drumming and modern drumming on his back. It's hard to find too many modern drummers who so comprehensively evolved the instrument, though we'll look at a couple, or who were such good technicians relative to their day. So, is Papa Joe the GOAT because he took an art that was in its infancy, the one-person rhythm section, and evolved it into high art and virtuosity? Well, he's certainly a strong contender. But what about the people who made jazz drums mainstream and became avatars for their generation? In practically every World War II movie, there's a dance scene, and it's even money the big band is playing either a song from the Count Basie Orchestra or from this band. The band for which our next contender held down the drum chair, the band of one Mr. Benny Goodman. And the song you hear is probably not just any Benny Goodman song, it's a song called Sing, 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 which put this contender on the world stage. I'm speaking, of course, of Gene Krupa. I should mention that an undercurrent of Krupa's popularity relative to other drummers in the 30s and 40s was probably that he was white, which shouldn't take away from his contribution to drumming. And it's hard to deny that Krupa's big, showy personality and brass drum solos inspired generations of young drummers. Krupa, also from Chicago, was actually a generation before Papa Joe Jones, the son of Polish immigrants. In his early career, Krupa studied with another of my favorite early drummers, Warren "Baby" Dodds, before getting the Benny Goodman drum chair in 1934. If popularizing an art is a component part of greatness, it's hard to argue Krupa, who lived in an era before viral videos or hashtags, doesn't deserve his spot in the pantheon. So, is Gene Krupa the GOAT because he put drums on the map in a way that made everybody growing up in the 1930s or 40s want to play them, and created a style that's still associated with that era and big band jazz today? We'll get back to this. But what about cold-blooded chop hounds? In the big band era, two drummers emerged as the drummers' drummers, arguably pushing pure technique and virtuosity farthest of anybody in their day. One you probably know from countless top 10 jazz drummer lists. The other, we'll see. I'm speaking about Buddy Rich and one Mr. Sonny Payne. Rich and Payne were born in the same era, and even in the same 5 boroughs. Rich in 1917 in Brooklyn, and Payne in 1926, also in New York. And you're probably familiar with Buddy's showiness and dazzling technique. But Payne, who replaced Papa Joe in Count Basie's orchestra in 1954, is on the shortlist for most virtuosic big band drummers of all time. Bear in mind as well, both of these guys were coming up in an era in which they personally were innovating a lot of the stuff they were playing on drums. There were no DVDs for them to study, though they both had their teachers and their influences. They were also part of a vibrant scene of jazz drummers. In 1955, Buddy collaborated with the aforementioned Gene Krupa on an album called Krupa and Rich. Payne, for his part, became Frank Sinatra's regular drummer, playing with Sinatra whenever he'd collaborate with the Basie Orchestra. And of course, Buddy continued playing and touring with his own big band well into the 70s and 80s, and was such a cultural icon, he was the inspiration for characters in movies like this one. Are Buddy and Sonny the GOATs because they push drum solos and drum technique with their virtuosity and showmanship? Possibly. But what about the drummers who evolved jazz drumming beyond its big band roots? Behind artists like Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker, Miles Davis, and John Coltrane. For that, we need another category. This category of drummers is replete with great players, and any of a long list including Art Taylor, Connie Kay, and Jimmy Cobb could easily stand in for any of these other drummers. But I'm choosing 3 to represent this movement. Kenny Clark, who arguably invented the sparser bebop drum style, with a swingy beat on the ride cymbal and comping with the other limbs. Philly Joe Jones, whose sound was probably the most ubiquitously associated with the latter part of the movement, culminating with records like Blue Train and the Cookin' Relaxin' with Miles series. And Max Roach, who together with Philly Joe, contributed arguably some of the most to the lexicon of jazz drum vocabulary we still utilize today. Though he's widely described as the father of bebop drumming, Kenny Clarke, born in Pittsburgh in 1914, was actually a contemporary of drummers like Papa Joe Jones and Buddy Rich. Crucially though, Clarke moved to New York in 1935, where he served as the house drummer for a club called Minton's Playhouse, one of the major birthplaces of the style that would come to be known as bebop. While playing alongside musicians like Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Christian, and Thelonious Monk, he began to experiment with playing the swing beat on the ride cymbal and using the bass drum for accents in addition to the type of feathering all the big band drummers would do. Musicians of the time called this dropping bombs. Because it became so ubiquitous in the style, we now just call it swinging. As a side note, it was the style of Clarke and his contemporaries that Jim Chapin immortalized in the book Advanced Techniques for the Modern Drummer. While Clarke was away serving in the military, another drummer rose to prominence alongside Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, and Miles Davis. Born in North Carolina in 1924 and moving to the beloved Brooklyn neighborhood of Bed-Stuy shortly after that, this drummer was, of course, the singular Max Roach. In addition to backing up those storied bebop bands in New York, Roach became known for his talents as a composer and bandleader and his melodic style at playing the drum kit. It's my belief that many of the licks that have become drum boilerplate originated with Max Roach. Finally, no conversation about the evolution of jazz drumming through the 1940s and 1950s is complete without Philly Joe Jones. Born 1 year before Max Roach in 1923, Philly Joe Jones, who adopted the name of his birthday to distinguish himself from Joe Jones of the Count Basie Orchestra, was probably the most ubiquitous drum presence on records from the 1950s that became classics, playing alongside bassman Paul Chambers behind both of the biggest stars of the day, Miles Davis and John Coltrane. Philly's drumming built on the style of Kenny Clarke and combined the melodicism of Max Roach with some good old-fashioned showiness and athleticism. Here's two-bass hit of Philly Joe classic. So maybe it's Philly, Max, or Kenny who's the GOAT, because they invented, developed, and became synonymous with bebop drumming, and were the first to play a bunch of stuff that ushered in what we now call modern drumming. Coordinated independence, melodic solos, though everybody from Papa Joe to Buddy Rich certainly did those too, and some of the iconic drum licks we all associate with jazz drumming. You know what I'm going to say, they're strong contenders. And we'll summarize all of this at the end of the video. It's here that I want to shout out some honorable mentions we won't have time to go into. Bill Evans drummers like Paul Motion, Marty Morell, and Joe LaBarbera for their subtlety and evolving of the previous generation's playing. One of the Bill Evans drummers we will mention later. As long as we're on the subject, folks like Vernell Fournier, Ben Riley, Shelly Manne, and Joe Morello deserve inclusion in any canon of great jazz drummers. Not to mention the singular Art Blakey, one of the founders of hard bop, and an explosive, expressive soloist. And the inimitable Mel Lewis, who together with the brother of a drummer we'll soon cover, developed a subtle big band language in contrast to brasher drummers like Rich and Sonny Payne. Oh, and let's not forget Joe Chambers, who played with Joe Henderson, Wayne Shorter, and Chick Corea, to name just a few. Any of these could also be in the conversation for greatness. Now, let's cover three drummers who took the already innovative drumming of the 50s and early 60s and pushed it forward yet again. Many conversations about Elvin Jones start and end with, "This is Elvin Jones. Nobody has played like him before." And though he's influenced generations of drummers, nobody's played like him since. Probably the most well-known of Elvin's many well-known recordings is this, from Coltrane's Love Supreme. Jones, brother of the aforementioned Mel Lewis collaborator Thad Jones, was born in Michigan in 1972. After a short stint in Detroit, Jones moved to New York and cut his teeth playing with Miles Davis, Charles Mingus, and Sonny Rollins, before joining the rhythm section that would make him famous, that of John Coltrane, including pianist McCoy Tyner and bassist Jimmy Garrison. If we say Elvin Jones's playing is powerful and organic, which I think is an accurate, if reductive characterization, another drummer in this trio of greats was maybe equally innovative, but with a very contrasting style. Roy Haynes, who shares a birthday with yours truly, leading me to wonder what I'm doing wrong, because if a birthday bestows drum greatness, maybe there's a mistake on my birth certificate. Anyway, Roy was born in Boston in 1925 and spent his early career in the drum chairs of Lester Young, Charlie Parker, and Bud Powell. Made countless records alongside people like Coltrane, Stan Getz, Jackie McLean, and my personal favorite of his collabs, one Mr. Chick Corea. Haynes took the standard jazz language that had been similar since Kenny Clarke and turned it into a Picasso painting, introducing angular ride cymbal rhythms, triplets, and using the hi-hat as a comping voice instead of only playing it on 2 and 4. If there's a style of drumming we can call crispy, Haynes was probably the father of it. Rounding out this trio of revolutionaries is a drummer who played in Bill Evans' trio, and with artists like Charles Lloyd and Miles Davis, and later Keith Jarrett, and who's still, it should be said, active and killing it. Born in 1942 in Chicago, Jack DeJohnette was a generation on from Roy Haynes and Alvin. And he sounds like a very organic blend of the styles of Alvin and Roy, but his career also encompassed a great deal of fusion and backbeat music. So, are any one of these three the GOAT because they took an already sophisticated idiom and evolved it into the 60s and beyond? There's a strong argument to be made for any of them. But what about drummers of the last 30 years? In the shadow of Wynton Marsalis, acoustic jazz enjoyed a 30-year renaissance, as musicians and audiences alike rediscovered recordings and players that had fallen out of fashion during the fusion era of the 70s and 80s. There are too many amazing contemporary drummers to count, and see this video for more on some of my favorites. But Jeff Tane Watts, Greg Hutchinson, and Brian Blade, along with people like Eric Harland, Ari Honig, Marcus Gilmore, and Bill Stewart, came to define this modern resurgence. Let's start with Tane. Born in 1960 in Easton, Pennsylvania, Jeff Watts rose to prominence in Wynton Marsalis's band, where his loose swing and creative use of metric modulations earned him eyebrow raises across a grateful nation. But I think of his long collaboration with Wynton's brother Branford as the drum seat that defined Tane's playing. Watts embodied the fluid triplets and metric elasticity of Elvin Jones, but also a driving, unapologetically simple, propulsive form of swing that was very unique. I should say still is unique, as Jeff is very much alive and crushing it. 2 songs from Branford's live album, Bloomington, embody Tane's playing. First, the propulsive, straight-ahead Savior's Lair. Then the Coltrane-esque winding Citizen Tango. Born in 1970, Gregory Hutchinson, or Hutch, defined the mixture of modern and classic drumming that became emblematic of jazz's renaissance. Hutch, a recent guest on the 80/20 podcast, came of age in Betty Carter's band, and describes a situation that came to define his approach to redefining the classic vocabulary.
The Brooklyn in me came out like, man, I'm not gonna sit here and have cats be like, oh, he's just copying. So I was trying to figure out ways to morph what they were doing, changing the stickings around, but it takes time to do it. So it goes back to what you said. And so at that point, I hadn't had it enough time to resonate. But when she said that, it immediately clicked in, okay, well, you know what? I have to disguise all this shit right now just to get through this. Otherwise, I'm fired.
One of the many recordings that showcases Hutch's style is this one with the Joshua Redman Band. Another frequent collaborator with Redman, Hutch's friend and contemporary Brian Blade, was born in the same year as Hutchinson, in Shreveport, Louisiana, and was an early student of the great Johnny Vodakovich. Blade was a yin to Tane and Hutch's yang, developing a propulsive, tom-heavy style defined by alternately light touch and explosive emotional play. Among the many things that showcase Blade's long and varied career is this clip with Wayne Shorter. So, do Tane, Hutch, or Blade deserve the title of GOAT because they took an already well-evolved idiom and managed to update it and bring it into the 21st century? Actually, let's recap our contenders. We've got the grandfather, Papa Joe. If we were awarding points based on distance traveled with jazz drums on your back, he'd be a strong contender for GOAT. We've got the popularizer, Gene Krupa, who inspired generations with his showy and out-front drumming. We've got the showman, Buddy Rich and Sonny Payne, who, behind some of the greatest big bands of the age, elevated technique and virtuosity to an art. We got the Bebopers, Kenny Clark, Max, and Philly, who evolved jazz drumming into the bebop era and created the modern jazz drum style. We've got the Revolutionaries, like Elvin, Roy Haynes, and Jack DeJohnette, who embodied the angst of the 60s and brought drums across the threshold to allow even greater expressiveness. And we've got the Contemporaries, like Tane, Greg Hutchinson, and Brian Blade, who breathed new life into jazz drums at the dawn of the 21st century. Is this reminding you of anything? Where are my Lord of the Rings nerds at? XYZ rings for the elves, XYZ rings for the humans, and if you're noticing, there's one jazz drummer that's been conspicuously absent for this whole video, and also that the Lord of the Rings lore culminates in the one ring to rule them all. For the person who doesn't know where I'm going, let me just say Tony Williams is my personal favorite. This is, after all, an opinion piece. But f***ing look at this. I mean, who does that? It's just so evolved, and so early in jazz drumming to be playing that evolved. Like this was, what, 64? Then he transitioned over to the fusion era. Then he did the whole band leading piece with the big Gretsch. And it's true, there would be no Tony without Papa Joe, without Max, without Philly Joe, without Roy. And you can make the case that any of these drummers deserves the title. But for me, it's gotta be Tony. Born in 1945 in Chicago, but spent most of his youth in Boston, where he made an impression on Roy Haynes. And at age 17, he joined Miles Davis, Ron Carter, George Coleman / Wayne Shorter, and one Mr. Herbie Hancock to produce this. Did we do a thing? I expect there will be no shortage of controversy on this one. I tried to include a lot of everybody's favorite jazz drummers and give people their due. I'm sure there are people that I've left out. I mean, Rashid Ali, for instance, and the free jazz, there are tons. But if you think I made a good faith effort, please leave a comment below. Let me know if you agree with the conclusions. Dudes, if you've been watching this long, you're definitely one of us. You're one of the insiders. If you feel like you're ready to study with me at one of the echelons we have for that, some of which are, and some of which are very affordable. Or if you'd just like to get the weekly lesson in the podcast early, you want it, we want it. It's my mailing list, you guys. Just click the link below the player and enter your email address in on the next page. And for your troubles, I'll send you a free drum course I don't show on YouTube. Dudes, it's been real. Always enjoy these. See you again real soon in another lesson of the week.